Well, good evening, and thanks very much for coming. It's going to be a rather strange journey we're going on this evening, and it's going to take you from my hometown to places much more remote. So, just to sort of explain the geography, whoops, where are we going? Oh, okay, good. Great, excellent. I was born and bred in Southampton. I still live there, on the south coast of the UK. You can see from this image, an aerial view, obviously Southampton's right up top there, and I live just here. Southampton's relationship to the water is an historic one. From the Romans, Vikings, troops of Agincourt, Titanic, the troops of the First World War and the Second World War all sailed down this place. It's a place of migration and immigration, of ingress and egress. And it's where I never learned to swim, because up until the age of 30, I was scared witless of the water. And I've tried to work out why I was so psychologically damaged by the notion of the water, which was right next to where I live. I mean, we hear the foghorns at night. It's somewhere, which I was very aware of, but couldn't enter. And I think that came from a memory which I don't have, because it came from a story that my mother told me about her father, who built the house in which she grew up. He served in the First World War, and he came back, and he built a modest house in the outskirts of Southampton. And in the bathroom was a big roll-top Victorian bath. And along the side of this bath, he'd painted a great big spouting whale. Well, for me, that story, I never met my grandfather, I never went to that house. I only had this as a memory at a remove, as a story told to me by my mother. Connected me, in my mind, the water with fearsome monsters, to the extent that I didn't even like taking a bath. I was a sensitive child. And it wasn't until in my late 20s, about nearly 30, when I was living unemployed in the East End of London, very far from the sea, when I decided I had to conquer this fear. And I went to this big old Victorian pool, one of these tiled pools in the East End of London, very echoing hall, and tried to sort of splash about and try to work out how to do this. And there was an elderly lady there. She must have been in her 80s. And she was wearing one of those rubber hats with the daisies on it, and a swimsuit, which I swear was probably corseted, probably with whalebone. Actually, it wasn't, but it looked as though it was. Very smart, sort of Esther Williams sort of figure. And she took pity on me. And she did what my games masters, what we called the torturers in chief at our school, who used to throw you in the deep end of the pool and tell you to get on with it. She did what he signally failed to do. She persuaded me to make an alliance with the water, to push my face into it. And that was a really difficult thing to do for someone who had never learned to swim. And that breaking of that liminal membrane, for me, was the start of a new life. Ever since then, every day, I swim in the sea. Every day. But not as I swam today. I swam at Cisco Beach, Dionys Beach, and I've swum 7 times today, actually. But not in beautiful beaches like you have here in Nantucket. My beach is this beach. Well, it's not really a beach. There's a power station on one side of the water, and on the other side, there's a medieval abbey, a ruined medieval abbey. But it's, to me, it's a very interesting place because it's a very storied place. It's a real place. It's a place where nature meets industry, and human history meets natural history, and that's what really interests me. That's what I'm trying to write about in this book, and it's what the sea does for me. I was looking at the sea this morning at Cisco, and there's a sea fret. You couldn't see more than 20 yards out to sea. You had this incredibly powerful notion of the big, wide, wild Atlantic out there. The sheer power, the magnetic power of that force, that natural force, you all know that here, living on this island. You're surrounded by it. I'm surrounded by it too. I'm on a bigger island, but it's the same thing. James was too. There's something that draws you on, but also repels you, because you know it's a mortal place. It's a place where you could easily lose your life. And I'm not talking about great white sharks, although that's not becoming a not indistinct possibility around the Cape and around the islands. But just the sense of letting go, of being taken by a body of water, the sense of the corporeal about that, the threat to yourself, but also the kind of promise that that holds. I know that might sound a bit crazy, but this is me at Ballston Beach in Cape Cod, a much more exquisite place. But even these beaches have their stories. And in the book, I talk about that quite a lot, but I'm just going to read you a little bit from the beginning, which is more about my swim in Southampton. And I swim there every day, so through the winter. If the tide falls at 4 a.m., that's when I swim in the dark. If there's snow on the beach, whatever. So it's a kind of compulsive, this is not exercise, this is compulsion. Out of the darkness, obscure noises drift from the docks, booming over the water. The red lights of the power station chimney blink like an industrial lighthouse, summoning and warning. You can be what you want to be in the dark. For me, it used to be nightclubs under London streets. Now it's another nocturnal performance. An hour before dawn, before the light starts to stain the summer sky violet, I ride back to the beach. Foxes sidle out of the woods and rabbits flash their white scuts at the approach of my bike light. High in the trees over the shore, a pair of tawny owls converse in screeches. Crows hang in the branches, all angular tails and beaks, as if they'd been born out of the bowls. All these creatures own this place in the interregnum of the dark. They should not be anywhere else. No one could have told you when you were young what would happen. They didn't dare. It's enough to realize that what we have lost is still ahead of us. I see things that are not there. One magical moment, I feel like a penitent. The sea is so still, it seems like a sin to break its surface. But I do. Swimming at night with a diminished sense of sight only makes the act more sensual. You feel the water around you. You lose yourself in its sway. Fish bite me, leaving loving grazes. I turn on my back, watching the stars fall. So it's a kind of crazy thing, but it's also a way of escaping the world in which we are all now shackled to blue screens. I bet you, like me, spent quite a bit of time looking at either the phone in your hand or a computer on your desk, working with the digital world. Well, there's another blue screen, the real blue screen of the sea and the sky. It's available to you here, but most people it's not. And I think nowadays people are fearful of the sea. In an age of being careful, people tell me to be careful. They tell me I should take a cell phone when I go to the beach. Well, what good would that be? I mean, you can't put a cell phone in your swimming trunks, and anyway, I don't wear them. And you can be 20 foot out in the water. I could have been out there at Cisco Beach this morning. I could have gone. No one would be there to save me if I'd been taken away. I think I want to be careless. I want to have less care in my life. I think we've become... If you think of Nantucket's history, its relationship to the sea, the people who dared the sea in a way, the people who hunted these animals. If you think of 19th century England, where sea bathing was an absolute mania. People built stone steps down into the water. No one would ever do that now. No one could possibly contemplate the idea of encouraging you to walk into very deep water. I think we've changed in our relationship to the sea, and I think we've turned our back on the sea. And that's a big problem. And I think that's where a lot of our problems of our disconnection with the natural world and with what's happening now in the greater world comes from that disconnection with nature, that we don't understand the processes of nature. You do here, you know the tides, you know your days are determined by the tides and by the weather. But most people aren't. They have no idea what's going on. And the greater story of our future, which lies in the ocean, which is really important. So that's my photograph taken by my landlady in Provincetown a couple of Januaries ago when there was snow on the beach. She thought it was very funny that I was swimming at that point. And the other aspect of what I want to talk to you tonight is about the animals that live out there. And I was looking at Cisco this afternoon, thinking, it looks blank. Herman Melville talked about the ocean skin through which we cannot look. That's another big issue with our comprehension of the sea. 90% of life on Earth lives in the sea. It gives us the oxygen we breathe. It carries the trade that we consume. It's the future of our world. It's been absorbing the greatest effects of global warming, absorbing carbon dioxide and absorbing heat. It's a sacrificial state, in a way. And the future is going to be played out at sea. I mean, it's where we'll have to look for our food, and it's going to determine the politics of this century. But it's not politics I'm interested in. I'm interested in what happens to the animals, in a way, because specifically with cetaceans, they are the bridge between us and the sea. They are what animate the sea. Generally, you do see sharks occasionally, turtles maybe, but what really leaps out literally from the sea to demonstrate that mammalian kinship, to demonstrate the sheer extraordinary life in the water, are cetaceans, because they are like us. And when this dolphin stranded on Provincetown Beach a couple of years ago, I hadn't seen such a perfect stranding in that way. And I had seen other stranded stations, but there was something sort of quite ritualistic about this animal. That's why I lay down beside it. My friend Dennis Minsky was taking samples for I4, but I wanted to say a prayer to it. I know that sounds nuts, but the fact is that this common dolphin was part of a pod of just 5 animals, which we'd seen the day before from the whale watch boat. So I had a responsibility to this animal. Barry Lopez talks about roadkill, about moving it to the side of the road and saying a little prayer for it. We're responsible. We've done animals a very great disservice. This museum is a testament to that. But we've done some really good things for animals as well. But it's the cetaceans of Cape Cod which really, as I became turned into this kind of swimming crazy person, I came to the Cape, and that was my first connection with whales. A truly life-changing thing. Anyone who's seen a whale, I'm sure most of you have seen whales here, but when you see it for the first time, it's utterly improbable. To see a humpback whale breaching maybe 30 foot from the prow of a boat, a whale watch boat, is this extraordinary connection. Suddenly it's a confrontation. I live in this water. This is me. You are like me. I can detect you. I am intelligent. What does that propose? So this past week, the humpback whales have been feeding in a gargantuan manner off Stellwagen Bank, uproariously. There's been a huge amount of bait fish there, sand eels, which they're foraging on. Coming up through these bubble net clouds, you know the story, I'm sure, where they blow bubbles around their bait, around the sand eels, and then come up, mouths gaping open like crows, baleen bristling. This animal has worn away its jaw on the seabed in its eagerness to get at the sea sand eels. It's a spectacle which is beyond words. There aren't words, there aren't human words for this sort of thing. You know, it doesn't compute. But there are words for what humans do to animals like this. This is an animal which has been called pleats because of its scarring from a boat screw, from a ship's propeller, which has left it with these great ridges. She's prospering, though. She's survived. 50% of humpbacks in Cape Cod Bay have been hit by ships or entangled in fishing gear. 80% of right whales have been damaged in that way. It's just an example of you know, the two things coming together, and they don't sit well, I suppose. But there's something utterly joyful about these animals, which transcends the sense of what effect we might have on them. And when a humpback whale just leaps like that out of the water, it's very difficult not to be anthropomorphic and see it as an expression of joy. And the fact is that we don't know what it means. We don't know what it means, but it looks like fun. So I go with the fun bit. And this whale spy-hopped right next to the boat last week. So it rose, I think it's a she actually, rose. So I was leaning over, I was the first person to see it, and I just saw a few little bubbles, and it wasn't a bubble net. I thought, what's going on there? A few more bubbles, and then behind the bubbles, this huge rostrum, this barnacled rostrum, and the belly and the pleats of the animal peering right up like that to make that connection, because she's looking at us through her eyes. Her eyes are just here. She's risen out of the water to look at us. It's astonishing. What do you say? I usually say sorry, actually, but a lot of people say other things. Some people sing, some people shout, but mostly the day when this whale appeared, it was a very slightly misty day. The sea was silvery. It was very calm. There weren't many people on the boat, and we all just fell quiet because around us there was at least 30 humpback whales, and they'd stopped feeding. They were just moving gently through the water, breaking the sea surface, breaking the ocean's skin. And our captain, Mark de Lumber, hard-bitten, Azorian descent captain, big, tough man, left the wheel and just stood over the side looking. And he's been doing this job for 30 years. He still leaves the wheel and just watches, like a little boy. Astonishing. That's what whales do to you. And I just want to talk a little bit about the person who took that photograph of me in the snow is my landlady in Provincetown, Pat de Groot. And the book has quite a lot about her because she's a remarkable woman. She's now 88. She's an artist. She used to kayak to the breakwater of Provincetown with a laundry marker and a board and feed flounder to an orca which had become resident briefly in Cape Cod Bay back in the 1980s. Feed it flounder so as to keep it in the region so that she could draw it. Pat she's my sea lady, actually. I don't call her my landlady. She's my sea lady. Remarkable woman. I've only just discovered her antecedents. She's always been very cagey to talk about her family. It turns out her mother was Jewish. She was Truman Capote's great muse at one point. But her grandparents owned Macy's. They were the people who bought Macy's from Macy's in the 19th century. So, interesting connection here. And if you remember that scene in Titanic, either in the movie or maybe any other treatment of the story, the elderly couple who refuse to take a lifeboat, and they go back to their cabin and lie on the bed and refuse. That was Pat's grandparents. So she's an amazing woman, and her connection to the sea goes back to the 1960s when she got to know Stormy Mayo's father. Stormy Mayo, who's the founder of Centre for Coastal Studies. This is his dad, who used to take Pat out tuna fishing. Pat caught this fish, not Charlie. Pat caught it. Pat won the governor's prize for this bluefin. To me, it just looks like that's been sort of photoshopped in. But no, she caught that fish. And her life has been dedicated to the sea. Her house, where I stay when I'm in Provincetown, is actually built on the beach over the sea. The sea goes underneath the house. It's more like an arc. And in big storms, the whole thing shakes like a ship at sea. She's also drawn the cormorants, which are commonly nest, double-crested cormorants, which nest on the breakwater. But in her reading, they become Habsburg royalty, aristocrats, not the despised, malodorous birds that the fishermen seem to dislike so much. They acquire characteristics of their own. She really feels the sea, I think. And this is one of her paintings. She's painted the same view from her window for 20 years. Sea and sky, sea and sky, sea and sky. But as you know, those things are never the same for 1 minute, let alone a day. She intuits the sea. She meditates with it. She absorbs it. An extraordinary woman. But the next person I wanted to talk about, who is another Cape Codder, is Thoreau. And for any of you who've read his walks through Cape Cod, they're extraordinary. And I was just thinking this earlier, we were just talking about great white sharks. And Thoreau makes his way up the back shore of Cape Cod. And at one point, he speaks to his companion. He says, there was no bathing on the Atlantic side on account of the undertow and rumor of sharks. And he and his friend go stay at the Highland Light, where they're told by the lout keepers not to swim in the surf. They would not do so for any sum, for sometimes they saw the sharks tossed up and quiver for a moment on the sand. Thoreau takes this with a pinch of salt, but shortly afterwards he sees a 6-foot shark within 30 feet of the shore. It was of a pale brown colour, singularly film-like and indistinct in the water, as if all nature had abetted this child of the ocean. He watched it come and go in a cove like a bathtub, describes it. And after exploring it, go slowly out again. And they stand there watching this animal. And it's really interesting because Thoreau's invests everything about his walks, as you know, with a very deep meaning. But even he can't come to terms with the sea. It's sort of somehow terrible. And they're walking at one point, and he sees a distant object on the sand, maybe a mile away, and as they get closer and closer and closer, it's a human head. A real example of the mortality of this shore. I mean, I think there's 3,000 wrecks off the back shore of Cape Cod. That leads me to my next person who I write about in the book. It's Sylvia Plath. People don't really associate her with the sea, but she was born and brought up on the North Shore, Boston. And as we know, she met a sad end. In fact, she was quite disturbed young woman. She knew Cape Cod very well. She spent her summers here working as a nanny. At that point, as you can see from this image, she's styling herself after Marilyn Monroe. She dyed her hair blonde, and but her sea was, again, quite a dark sea. And she wrote a memoir. The last thing she ever wrote was a memoir called Ocean 1212W, which was her grandmother's phone number on the North Shore. And she speaks about a terrific storm breaking it over Boston, having come over from Cape Cod. And she writes, and this is very interesting given that this is the last piece of prose she ever wrote. Her last sentence is, "My final memory of the sea is of violence. A still, yellow day in 1939, the sea molten, steely slick, heaving at its leash like a broody animal, evil violence in its eye. 2 days after that, she committed suicide, as you probably know. And if you backtrack to that story, there was one period where she was happy, and it was the 6-week honeymoon she spent at Nauset with Ted Hughes. And in her poem, Daddy, a very famous and bitter, acidic poem, there's only one window of beauty in that poem, and it's when they're at Nauset Beach and they see a seal swimming in the sea and its head bobbing up at the surface. Sylvia's mother wanted her to go to Provincetown. She thought she would be well there. After one of her suicide attempts, she actually tried to drown herself after her heroine, Virginia Woolf. I wonder if she got to Provincetown, if her life had been different. Sadly, it wasn't. But I'm interested in how artists and writers are drawn to the sea and what they invest it with, because if this was a dry planet, if all the sea had dried up, I mean, obviously we would be dead, but imagine it just for an instance. Where would we invest our souls? Where would we invest our imagination? The sense of the planet as not a knowable place, the sense of a huge 2/3 of the surface of this earth is water, but not just that, the depth falls down to the Mariana Trench. You know, only 3 people in the world have ever been down there. And one of those was James Cameron, the director of Titanic. We know more about the moon than we do about the surface of the sea bottom. And I really like that notion that there is something out there that we don't entirely encompass, that's not within our dominion, that's not knowable, that it isn't explained. We only know a quarter of the species in the sea. We only have identified a quarter of the species. We just don't know what's down there. What does that represent for our future? The shores of Cape Cod, especially Long Nook, Coast Guard Beach, to me, these crumbling seas, shores rather, are a real marker of what's happening. I was last in Provincetown in October, and I came back last month to find Herring Cove, the car park at Herring Cove, had just completely disappeared. So this erosion is happening really quickly, and it's I wonder how we are going to deal with that. Not mechanically, not economically, not practically, but how we're going to deal with the fact that the sea is coming up. It's almost that kind of violence that Sylvia Plath talks about. That's to invest it with sentience, which is ridiculous, I know, but sometimes it does feel quite sentient. This afternoon it did to me. It felt as though it was drawing me in. I couldn't get away from it. But of course, the sea, when I talk about the sea, I always think of Melville. I always think of, he's our greatest writer about the sea, to my mind. Moby-Dick begins with that extraordinary opening chapter where he talks about people ineluctably drawn to Battery Park to go and stand at the very tip of Manhattan, where he was born. He was born in Pearl Street. So this was a deep childhood memory for him too, like Sylvia Plath. And it was a conflicted memory. The sea is not a positive place in Moby-Dick. Spoiler alert, you know, what it does at the end. Which is to rather understate the matter. And I always go back to Melville because he intuits things about the sea which seem extraordinary for 1851. He writes that amazing chapter, Does the whale diminish, will he perish? And he talks about the world being flooded anew and the seas rising over the Tuileries gardens and the Kremlin. But the whale surviving, he will spout his frothed defiance to the skies. I mean, it's a prophetic scene. From a time when, you know, Darwin's theories were new, the notion of extinction was blasphemous. Melville said of Moby-Dick, I've written a blasphemous book and I feel as spotless as the lamb. It's as though he'd known what he was doing. He was creating this time bomb for the future. it's still an incredibly relevant text for anyone who reads it now. I was listening today to Nat Philbrick's recording of the chapter about Nantucket for the Moby-Dick Big Read that I curated, which we had amazing people reading from the book. It's free, it's online, you can hear the whole book read for you by people like Nat and Mary Oliver and John Waters and Tilda Swinton and Benedict Cumberbatch and Stephen Fry. And the way that that book still works now, we've had 5 million hits on that site. That speaks to a need for poetry of the sea, I think. And of course, in Moby Dick, the poetry is invested in the whale. And that notion of evil is not, it's not the whale that Ahab is in pursuit of, Ahab invests the whale, the great white whale, with this sense of maliciousness and this careering, mad vengeance he's about to wreak on this animal. What Melville's saying in that book is actually there's only one animal on this planet which is capable of evil, and it's Homo sapiens. It's quite clear about that. And just as a sort of, partly through visiting New Bedford last week and look at its collection and also the work here, I've become very interested in the way whales were being represented, especially because Melville writes those great chapters of the monstrous pictures of whales and then of the less monstrous pictures of whales. And he maintains that it's not until the early 19th century that the first accurate picture of a sperm whale is created. Well, history, I'm afraid, proves him wrong, and it proves him wrong via his own genealogical descent, because he was, of course, half Dutch, and the Dutch in the 16th and 17th century drew incredibly accurate pictures of sperm whale strandings, which were happening with great frequency around the Netherlands, around the North Sea shores, so in the Baltic as well, but especially in the North Sea. And the whale becomes this omen. I mean, it's such a Melvillian scene. And you have scenes of disaster at the top, but also of good fortune. So it wasn't just a sense of it representing disaster, but it could be good fortune, because a whale did represent good fortune. We don't need to tell you that in this place. Amazing image from 1577. This is 1577. And it's those are pretty accurate images of sperm whales. This was a mass stranding off Scheveningen, where 13 animals, there's another 10 out in the three of them died, but 10 more survived. This kept on happening. And it becomes part of culture, and it's really interesting to me that whole thing about human and natural history, the two meetings of those two cultures of histories, is really explicit here. And this image by a painter called Antitheson, which was painted in the early 17th century, was recently renovated. It was cleaned, and as they renovated it, they realized, I'll just do that again. Why did someone paint over that? Why did someone paint over that? That just fascinates me. Why would you paint over it? Surely that's the point of the painting, isn't it? Poses a very interesting question. Was it because they were unsettled by the presence of the dead Leviathan? Do they feel guilty, or do they think it just looks prettier without a whale in it? Just extraordinary. But it really speaks to that sense of absence and presence to me, of the way we've looked at these animals. That someone and they think it was done in the 18th century, someone just didn't like the whale. It didn't figure in their interior decor, I suppose. And it counterpoints with a terribly sad scene from January 2016, when there was a mass stranding of sperm whales around the North Sea. 29 sperm whales stranded from the east coast of England, Calais, the Netherlands, and Germany. And I was here when this was happening, and it just seemed extraordinary. I couldn't believe what was happening. It happened over a space of maybe a week, 29 strandings. And it just seemed like, I mean, I was becoming a bit Melvillian. It seemed like an omen, you know, what's happening? This was taken by my friend Jeroen, a Dutch scientist and photographer, and he went to the stranding of 5 sperm whales off the island of Texel in the Netherlands, and sadly the animals were alive when he took this photograph. But the appearance of a rainbow at the same time as these animals are expiring on the beach, it's one of those 16th or 17th century paintings, isn't it? And of course, inevitably, people projected things onto this. In the press, in the media, I wrote at least 2 articles about it. And a necropsy, which is what happens on an animal instead of an autopsy, on one of the sperm whales, the German strandings, found pieces of plastic from a car this big in this whale's guts. And inevitably, the story came about that, plastic is killing these animals. And that's actually borne out by a report last week that every stranded whale examined in the Mediterranean since 2001, every one has had plastic in its guts and was probably implicated in its death. But that's not the case with these animals. Most of them were dying of dehydration. They hadn't eaten, they hadn't fed because they were in the shallow sea of the North Sea. Why had that happened? Well, another very interesting scientific paper appeared just a few months ago, which established a very convincing correlation between big solar storms around that winter time of 2016. Big solar storms, which I don't know if you remember, there was a big display of the Northern Lights at that point. There was a lot of photographs of them. It was a big eruption of the Northern Lights. The same storm, the same electromagnetic storm, according to this paper, and it is quite, and they examined other cases, probably disrupted the whale's sense of navigation, which relies on electromagnetic paths in the Earth's crust, and deceived them to coming into the North Sea. So that 17th century notion of the omen of something in the stars actually is in the stars. And actually these whales are kind of, it just speaks to this world that we sometimes ignore, a very interlinked world, that the sun can affect these animals in that way. It's an extraordinary notion. But just to sort of, for my last section of what I want to talk about, my connection with whales, which was established in Cape Cod and with working on the whale watch boats as a volunteer, seeing those amazing animals, always at the back of my head was the story behind these things, because they are very different animals to humpback whales. They behave entirely different. They're not of this world. Humpback whales demonstrate their kinship with us every day off Stowaggan Bank. Sperm whales spend 90% of their life deep, deep down in the depths. They are the most efficient, most spectacular divers. It's very difficult to see them for that reason. So this whale, which was the most exploited whale of the 19th century, is actually now one of the least known animals. And it is extraordinarily resonant of that disconnection I'm talking about, because up there in that skull is the biggest brain on the planet. The biggest brain on the planet. No one knows why this animal has to have such a big brain. There are various theories, but that scientific knowledge, which kind of vindicates Melville's obsession with these animals, also drew me on to see them. I became obsessed about the notion and the actuality of these animals. And so if you live in the UK, and actually here on the east coast of America, one of the best places to see sperm whales are the Azores. And I know you'll be leading a trip there later, James, and I know some of you have been to the Azores. But they are the most extraordinary places. They're barbaric, black, satanic places. They don't have beaches. They're just volcanoes that have erupted from the mid-Atlantic ridge. They're just the tops of terrain that would look utterly extraordinary if we could see it out of the water, way exceeding any of the mountains or valleys we have on terrestrial Earth. They are younger than the whales that swim around them. The whales were around before the islands of the Azores appeared, the archipelago of the Azores. But it is where sperm whales make their home now. Very deep water. You only have to go 100 yards out from shore, and the depth falls to half a mile. You go out a mile, and it falls to 3 miles deep. It's the abyssal depth of that terrain, of that seascape, which becomes home for this extraordinary animal, which exceeds all superlatives. It's a transformational animal. It actually shape-shifts when it dives. It draws its fins into its side like an aircraft's undercarriage. It shuts down every organ in its body except for its brain and its heart. The lungs collapse. That rib cage collapses in, and the whole animal becomes supremely hydrodynamic. It doesn't look very hydrodynamic with that big square head, but in fact the head narrows as well as it starts ready to dive. And unlike humpback whales and fin whales, which dive like that, the sperm whale dives like that. And the sheer calorific energy of something so extraordinary is a wonder to behold. And you do start to realize what Melville's going on about when you see these animals. Because from the surface, they're very enigmatic, because that's generally all you see of them is the fluke. If you do see them at the surface, they just look like logs lying there, sort of wrinkly logs. And they seem to change color under the Atlantic sun. They look sort of ebony black or dove gray or the color of cocoa, slick with the water. They're continually sloughing their skin. When we were following them, I picked out skeins of this skin which came out of the water. It's like tissue thin. It's like the whale is sort of leaving bits of itself behind as it moves through the water. So supremely hydrodynamic. When they designed submarines, they based them on sperm whales. And they can stay down for 2 hours. We tracked one sperm whale in the Azores for 1 hour and 45 minutes, just hunting deep, deep down. And then the clicks got really fast and then stopped because it was feeding. It had found what it was after. Probably giant squid. They eat giant squid there. Also smaller squid, but we saw sperm whales come to the surface and giant squid's tentacles floating out and bits of them floating out of them. So they are these stupendous animals, and I've been to the Azores now a number of times under a license from the Azorean government. And when you look at them through the water, and this is one of my favorite photographs of a sperm whale, and I know it sounds crazy, but this whale is coming alongside us. She's a very large female. There's her jaw. There's her head. And she's lateral. She's just a few inches beneath the water. She's doing that so she can look at us, like the spy-hopping humpback. And there's just those few inches, literally the ocean's skin, between me and the biggest thing I've ever come close to, the biggest animate thing I've ever come close to. And she glided just gently past our boat. We were on a little Zodiac and passed by. It's the most astonishing thing. But being a mad, compulsive person that I am, I had to break that skin. And so I got in the water. That's me. That's the whale. I can't tell you what happened at that point because partly you get so excited that the adrenaline kind of takes over. And also it was private. It was a private conversation between me and the whale. And another whale we met was this Subadult Female. She's part of a pod of 12 we followed all day. They're very, very curious animals. They're curious about us, and they're curious implicitly. This animal, I sent this photograph to Hal Whitehead, who's probably the preeminent scientist working on sperm whales, because I'd never seen markings like this, and neither had Hal. She's sort of half a Moby-Dick. So she has this sort of wonderful grey, and then it breaks up into this band of pale dove grey, and then back into sort of freckles. It's like an haute couture gown by a Japanese designer. And she was perfectly aware of her beauty. She was pirouetting in the water. At one point, she turned underneath me, belly up, because that's the only way a sperm whale can see a human being or whatever else might be in the water, stereoscopically, because their eyes go out that way, but if they turn up, they can see. So they can see you stereoscopically. You're hearing me? Yep. And this is a group of 5 whales, which we saw earlier that week. A large female, 1, 2, 3, and a tiny whale just hidden behind there, which is probably her calf. The other 3 juveniles are not hers. She would only have 1 calf at a time. They belong to other females who are now diving. The calves can't dive. They're still suckling. They still suckle at the age of 13. She's performing what we call alloparental care. It's an act which, to me, seems to be deeply altruistic. She's taking care of these other, it's a creche. She will even suckle other whales' calves. And when you're in the water with these animals, they are talking to one another all the time. You feel it in your body because it reverberates through you, but you feel it sort of almost psychically in a way because you feel that they can only exist together. They can only exist communally. That's the case with all toothed cetaceans, dolphins, sperm whales, orca. They can only prosper together. It's a lesson, really. And you feel that in the water. You feel that connection. It's like this sort of whale wide web that they are continually talking to one another, continually reassuring one another, perhaps. I mean, I don't know what's going on. No one knows. No one knows. But they are communicating. They are communicating. And when they come up to you, and many times they will come right up to you as close as you want and look at you with this eye. It's impossible what you say, what you do. I mean, it's something as big as that, with a pretty small, relatively small eye, taking an interest in you, which isn't a predatory interest. They have no interest in harming you. They're not going to eat you, contrary to many stories. They know you are like them. I know that absolutely because we know that their sonar looks physically through a body. It can tell the temperature of your body. It can tell how a cetacean can tell how you are feeling. That's how they work together because they know when another is happy, loved up, angry. They can tell. Cetaceans can tell if a woman's pregnant before she knows she's pregnant. So these animals can see through you. They can see through you. It's difficult not to think of that as a kind of ESP. It's very disconcerting. It's very disconcerting. I can't explain it. And the scientists who work in this field, I think, people like Hal Whitehead, who asks crazy questions because he's confronting something which, in 100 years' time, people will say, why didn't you know? Didn't you realize? 100 years after all this happened, we turn round to the whalers of Nantucket and New Bedford and say, well, these were sentient animals. But they had their own issues there. We have our own issues now. We don't know what the 100 years' time will say about us and the way we've treated the ocean. We don't know what's going to happen. But it seems to be that animal is interrogating us. I know that's anthropomorphic, but that's what it feels like when you're in the water with them. And this is just as a prelude to a very short little film I'm going to show. It's about 4 or 5 minutes long, which I filmed with my friend Andrew Sutton, who's the underwater photographer I work with. In Sri Lanka, in the past 4 or 5 years, they've identified an extraordinary megapod of sperm whales in their thousands. I've been there twice now. Last spring, we swam with a pod. We were in the water with a pod of 150 sperm whales. It was a truly Melvillian scene, truly. To have the water animated all around you, these big whales. They go to a particular area of the Indian Ocean, it appears, again, we're not quite sure, but they certainly go there to mate because they were doing it under our boat. Going right under, we were in a 19-foot Indian, Sri Lankan fishing boat, no GPS, no life jacket, no nothing, just us and the Sri Lankan captain and his friend, that just going underneath us, mating. The most extraordinary thing. We spent that day with that pod continually in the water with them. They were coming up to us. You could smell them. Sperm whales, the old whalers used to say you could smell sperm whales from miles away, and that's true. They really do smell. It's a very recognizable smell when you smell them. Clicking, swimming underneath us, upside down to look at us. But then the kind of encounter changed. So I'm going to show this very short film now. Hopefully, if I can get out of this. Can we turn up the sound, Yeshi?
It's always an anxious moment, getting in the water with cetaceans. They're exquisitely beautiful creatures, and for all their size, quite calm and placid. Under the veil of what Herman Melville called the ocean's skin, these animals were playing, doing more than that, in fact. Spring is the time when sperm whales seem to come to this part of the Indian Ocean to mate in these deep blue waters. A pair of young males approached us. They're very curious creatures. They seem to find human beings interesting. And as we swam with them, it was impossible not to be impressed with their beauty, their strange, elegant shapes, so supremely in control of their environment. Silent, majestic, able to dive for a mile deep and stay down for more than 2 hours as they search for their favorite food, squid. They are apprehensive of humans and their boats, even if they dwarf our little vessels. Again and again we went into their world, a topsy-turvy world for us, a world in which we have no control, but a world where the whale reigns supreme. And when they dive, raising their flukes vertically out of the water, it's almost impossible to imagine that you were sharing the sea with them. These waters were alive with other creatures, olive ridley turtles and spinner dolphins, also in mating mode. Then everything changed. There was a large conglomeration of sperm whales, an estimated 100, perhaps 150 of the animals. We were right in amongst them.
They're right there, see? Are those dolphins? No, those are not rissos, those are much bigger. False killer whale, I think.
They seemed to be moving towards an appointed destination, gathering about 30 animals in a cluster at the surface. It was an astonishing encounter. In front of us was just wall-to-wall whale. They seemed to be agitated. We could hear them blowing and raising their flukes. Suddenly, another dorsal fin broke the water.
Oh my God!
Looking down into the water, Drew could see what the animals were. Not dolphins, as I thought, but killer whales. Orca, the apex predator in the ocean. We could hear the clicks of the sperm whales versus the hunting clicks of the orca. We saw the orca's dorsals riding high in the water, circling as they dove under the sperm whales. We could hear two groups of whales reacting to one another, the hunters and the hunted. For almost 2 hours, we watched the orca circling around the sperm whales. Sometimes it seemed that they were about to come up in the middle of the animals. Although, when we saw the footage later, we realized that sperm whales had been diving down in a kind of column beneath them. Underneath the water, these great animals with their metre-thick blubber were presenting a united front against this attack. They were continually opening and closing their jaws, both a sign of stress, but also of aggression. It was the most astonishing sight. From the surface, you could see the intensity of the animals gathered together. We'd never seen such a biomass in one place. Suddenly, the orca started to appear under our boat. We realized that their behavior had changed in another way. Both Drew and I have been on many whale watching operations and trips, but this is the only one I can remember when we became an object of intense scrutiny by these sentient, brilliant hunters.
Probably teaching how to attack sperm whales.
We thought we were watching one group in the distance, a ways off. But then suddenly, with a plosive blow, we realised there was another group right beside us. Had we frustrated their hunt? Were they actually turning on us now? It seemed impossible. But when this tight-knit clan of sea wolves turned and banked underneath us, it was quite clear that their intentions weren't just based on curiosity. The data that Ranel was gathering, both visually and acoustically, would provide vital information for a scientific study of this unique behaviour Perhaps it's the first time it's ever been observed in such detail and at such length. Were the animals testing us? Or were they trying to work out what we were? Whatever the truth, what happened next was extraordinary. Drew and I, and the rest of the people on our boat, had never experienced. On one side, 4 orca came charging directly at our boat. It was quite clear they were using well-known techniques employed by orca in the Southern Ocean, where they use a compression wave to tip an ice floe on which a seal might be lying. One of the orca females had a calf with her. Orca have a matrilineal culture. Hunting techniques are passed down from mother to calf. We thought perhaps we're part of one big training exercise. At one point, the whales approached us. We felt a sharp blow. It was clear we'd actually been struck by the animals. It was, one must admit, both an exhilarating and a terrifying prospect. What would have happened if those whales had succeeded in their attempt to turn us over in their deadly game?
Thanks very much. I don't know if anyone has any questions or observations. Yes, please.
How do you know?
Sadly, we know because they are some of the most experimented on animals, dolphins, which have been kept in captivity since the 1950s, both by the military and also by SeaWorld, etc. And they've conducted experiments with them where they visibly... the dolphin will go to a woman's belly, very distinct interest in the belly, and they, by process of elimination, they've, with people, they've proven that, yeah. Yes, James.
Philip, what's your take on, you know, this is the home of the Essex, right? And,
Yeah.
Then the Anne Alexander was struck same year, in 1851, when Moby-Dick was written. And here you are swimming with sperm whales. And have you noticed any aggression from sperm whales that led to what happened then?
I've never seen it, but then I'm not trying to hunt them. It's quite clear from many records, I think, that the sperm whales did turn on, the records you have here, that sperm whales did turn on boats. Often, I think, probably because there's that chapter in Moby-Dick Grand Armada, which stands out as this beautiful, it's almost the first literary example of whale watching, where Ishmael and Queequeg look over the side, and like the spy-hopping whale I saw in Provincetown last week, they see a mother and calf coming up to the surface, and the calf is still attached by umbilical cord. And it's a sort of a transcendent description in Ishmael's words. It's very beautiful. But immediately after that, the killing begins. And they kill the calves because that brings in the mothers. And the most dangerous thing in the world is an enraged mother whose calf is being attacked, or child. That's, I think, possibly that is maybe the source of some of those attacks. I've never felt any aggression from sperm whales. The only time I've ever felt that a little was in the Azores, when we were behind a trio of 3 whales, and the center whale was a calf, and we came too near, and the 2 outriding females whacking their tail up, and that really keep away. Of course, the whalers called that the hand of God, didn't they, which dispense you into eternity. Boy, I really saw that. Having been in the water at close level with those whales, those tails, I mean, they're just huge. They're huge. And it's just, 2/3 of the animal is muscle. I mean, it's just a sense of power. It's very beautiful. But that encounter, and the orca were definitely, I mean, we didn't have film of it because we weren't filming when these whales were charging us. We were scared. But 5 of them came directly at the side of the boat. There was no mistaking what they were trying to do. They were trying to tip the boat over. And they don't hit the boat normally. They tip it with a compression wave. But what I found really remarkable about that encounter is those orca hit the boat at least 3 times, maybe 5 times. A whale doesn't do that by accident. A whale absolutely has some mastery and choreography of any sort of encounter at sea. They were definitely doing that on purpose. We'd got in between them and the sperm whales, and we'd frustrated their hunt, and they were working out their aggression on us, I think. Yeah. But what was really interesting about that encounter is that 3 species of mammal were there, human, orca, and sperm whales. And there was this extraordinary, there's me, I was saying, I can't watch this because I didn't want to see a sperm whale predated, but of course you couldn't leave the scene. I mean, it's the compulsion of it. Were we affecting that situation? We probably were by being there, because I realize now in retrospect, and when we looked at the GoPro footage, the underwater footage, it's quite clear that the whales start to use us as a defensive wall. The whales were lined up like that, parallel, with the females in the middle, and we'd seen them further down, maybe a couple of miles away. We'd seen a lot of whales moving quickly. The reason why we came upon those whales was we'd seen a lot of whales moving at great speed, and when they move at great speed, their heads rise up. I didn't realize that. It really is that Melville scene, many of the scenes. So their heads rise up like that when they're moving at speed. And so you see that. And they came to that, and they'd been summoned by a distress signal by the females who were worried about their calves because they knew the orca were moving in. So the males all pulled in around the females and the calves, and the males presenting they are armored vehicles, really, in a way. And it was a bit like a sort of Roman centurion sort of, like creating this phalanx. And not only that, but as we knew from when we were in the water and from the GoPro footage, they had other whales were deputed to keep diving down like that to keep the orca from coming up in the middle, which is what they were trying to do. But to see, and there were 2 pods of orca, there was in total of 24 orca, and to see them controlling their attack, which was entirely directed by the matriarchs, the 2 matriarchs of the 2 pods, you could see them hanging back, and they were directing it. You could see that. And the 3 intelligences, the human intelligence, the orca intelligence, and the sperm whale intelligence, in this extraordinary encounter, it was. I will never see anything like that in my life again. I mean, it was astonishing. At the end of it, Ranald, the Sri Lankan scientist, had his hydrophone in the water to record the sounds. He pulled it up, and it had been bitten off. So, yeah. Any other questions? Thank you. Thanks very much.